Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some Path of Exile 1 discussion. Today, I wanted to take a look at the early meta that's developing in patch 3.26. What builds have overperformed expectations, what builds have underperformed expectations, what are the most popular builds, and what are some things that basically no one is playing. Today, we're going to take a bit of a stats-driven look, looking at characters that have reached high levels in the core game. So we're going to be focusing upon none of the hard modes in play, not hardcore, not soft. So we're going to be looking at this in softcore, trade enabled, and without the ruthless optional rule set. So we're going to be looking at this in softcore, trade enabled, and without the optional ruthless rule set. Those all do change the meta quite a bit, and we won't really... Those optional rule sets do change the meta quite a bit, but we're not going to go into that in any detail in this video. Now, a couple of things that we want to just start out by saying. Firstly, Trade League build diversity based on skill use is in a really weird spot in this league. We've got one massive overperformer, and then other than that, we've actually got quite a lot of build diversity. This is something that we haven't seen in a while. It's played out differently in the past when there's been one build that's outperformed everything else. The other thing that's notable though is that this is starting to self-correct a bit. More on that later, but the top build of this league has fallen from 30% at its peak of the player base to down under 20% now, and more on that later, but the top build of this league, Volcanic Fissure of Snaking Berserker, has fallen from around 30% of the player base very early in the league to now under 20%, and it's continuing to fall. Another similar thing applies when we have a look at ascendancies. We've got one that really overperforms, but then we've got a lot of things that are doing okay. More on that again when we have a look at the ascendancy breakdown. The other thing that has to be said is that there were some major balance changes about 7 days into the league. These made it so that mercenaries that are wearing Doriani's prototype are much tankier than anyone would have reasonably expected going into this league. What this means is that for many builds, the strongest thing you can do is respec to something that is dealing physical damage and convert that to lightning, or into something that deals inherently lightning damage, and then use Doriani's prototype to scale that damage into the stratosphere. However, this has not really flowed through the player bases yet. Number of reasons for this. Basically, it just takes a while for people to level new characters, and especially for them to start showing up. So keep that in mind. This is going to change quite a bit as we go into week 3. Methodology here, I've done these videos a number of times before, so I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. But basically, Grinding Gear Games publish a whole bunch of information on the top 15,000 characters by XP, and there's a website that scrapes this and also has a look at their profiles, assuming that they haven't actively hidden them, and then aggregates that information into a conveniently digestible form. This website is POE.ninja, and what we're going to do in this video, I'm just arbitrarily cutting off at level 95. So, PoE Ninja has some information, it's incomplete on characters at level 94 and below, but 95 and up, it has quite a bit of information on most of those characters, and as a result, that's going to be what we're basing things on. Note that a small number of players opt into options on PoE Ninja that allow them to hide their character entirely, and that's something that's going to end up with those players not appearing on this list. Now, we already mentioned that hard modes, so the optional solo self-found or hardcore or ruthless rule sets, all these tend to constrain build choices, promoting the stronger and easier to start builds. This league, solo self-found has very little build diversity in it. In solo self-found, people are just basically playing Volcanic Fissure of Snaking to start because it's something that was hyped a lot pre-league, and it was hyped for good reason. It's a very good build on very terrible gear. However, in Trade League, where you could count upon getting your hands on various unique items that might take a little while to find in solo self-found, we're talking things here like Barracks Respite, the Taming, and a number of other tier 3 rarity and even tier 2 rarity uniques. These are much less accessible in solo self-found, and that means that builds that might want to use those items end up not being league started. They tend to be things that people might consider as a second build of the league, and people aren't yet necessarily at the point of second builds. That said, so yeah, SSF So yeah, SSF build diversity is in the dumpster, and that's because Volcanic Fissure of Snaking is just performing so well there. Another thing that's important to note is that popular build guides also have a big impact on the meta, and that's also the case with Volcanic Fissure of Snaking. This is something where you could play Earth Shatter, you could play Sunder. They're not much worse than Volcanic Fissure of Snaking, but if you look up for information online as to what information... But if you look for information online as to how to gear Volcanic Fissure of Snaking, you'll find a lot of it. If you look for information on how to gear Sunder, you'll find a lot for getting through the campaign, but there's a lot less once it comes to clearing the Atlas, and that's probably the part people are looking for guidance in. So for that reason, popular build guides definitely do warp things a bit, and it'll be interesting to see how it evolves now that Volcanic Fissure of Snaking is starting to fall off. This was also a league that had a bunch of new endgame content. Endgame content started out extremely rippy. It has been adjusted back since. But a lot of people want to beat pinnacle bosses fast. And this then incentivizes playing builds that don't rely upon getting specific unique items or complex crafts in order to get rolling. And again, this is one of those central reasons Volcanic Fissure of Snaking had so much And this is one of those central reasons Volcanic Fissure of Snaking just did so well early on in this league. Now, there's also something that I need to mention that I am very not happy with Grinding Gear Games about, and this is stealth changes to the rarities of items. At least 2 very high-profile Uber Pinnacle boss drops were made substantially rarer in patch 3.26. From the Uber Exarch, this is the Celestial Brace. This swapped in rarity with Crystallized Omniscience. Now, Crystallized Omniscience in the past was something you would never ever league start around, because this item could be expensive, it could be chase, and it could be very hard to get. Now, it's super common. You could easily do a league starter based on... In Trade League, you could easily have league started Crystallized Omniscience this league. Well, it's not really going to work until you get to endgame, but if you started on day 3 or 4 of this league, you could have picked up your Omniscience if you're experienced with trade, and started gearing around it, and you would have been fine. However, the Celestial Brace is now very rare. From Uber Maven, we also had 2 items swapped there. Progenesis went from rare to mythic rare, and Grace of the Goddess went from mythic rare to rare. Now, honestly, I don't mind these changes. The problem is that they weren't disclosed to the player base at all, and this meant... Honestly, I don't mind these changes. The problem is they weren't disclosed to the player base at all. And so a whole bunch of people rolled champion in good faith, believing, oh yeah, I'm probably not going to be able to get Replica Badge of the Brotherhood for a while, but at least I'll have the Uber Exarch gloves. They won't be too bad. And now it turns out that the Uber... And that's something that's really important to the way I want to play the build. Well, now that item is 50 Divines. Well, now that item is 50 Divines. Well, now that item is 50 Divines in trade. This is something that was previously very accessible. Okay, on the flip side, Replica Badge of the Brotherhood is much cheaper than anyone expected, and that does help reclaim some of that power that's lost on the champion, but ultimately, it's something that's probably... But ultimately, it's something that's been a very nasty surprise for people who league started champions. It's been noticeable, looking through the stats recording this video, that a number of people have abandoned the champion ascendancy as a result of this change. Those people probably would have league started something entirely different if that change had been disclosed to the player base in advance. What's not clear to me, did these players elect to swap over to the Slayer? Did these players elect to roll a new character? Or did they quit the league entirely? I think there's probably a bit of all of them. There's definitely no large exodus over to the Gladiator. There's not been a lot of Gladiators this league, but there definitely hasn't been a large exodus from the champion to the Gladiator. I can see that from looking at the numbers, but whether there was a big swap over to the champion, but whether there was a big swap over to the Slayer, or whether these people just quit the league, that I can't really tell at all. In terms of other item notes, though, something that's really important that I've noticed is that unique item use across the board just seems really low this league. I think this is because recombinated rares are better, and recombination, people understood it going into this league. It's a bit worse than it was in 3.25, but it's also much more understood, and it's just better than pretty much every other form of crafting. There's a couple of exceptions here. The belt has There's a couple of exceptions here. The belt slot has ridiculously good uniques, both Mage Blood and Headhunter at the top end, but even cheaper than that, you've got Darkness Enthroned, which is fantastic. You've got Tides of Time at lower budget. There's also a couple of other There's also a couple of other single build items like Perseverance and Auxium that are pretty good as well, pretty hard to bet. There's also a couple of single build items. There's Perseverance, there's Immortal Flesh, there's the less popular Auxium. All of these are really good, and so the belt slot rares don't really compete there. The amulet slot, there's a number of really, really, really good uniques there as well. But ultimately, this is a league where unique item use is down overall. There were a whole bunch of buffs in 3.25 to the new armor and evasion. There are a whole bunch of buffs in 3.25 to all of the armor bases, and when I say armor here, I don't just mean things with a strength requirement that add the armor stat, but I'm also talking evasion and energy shield bases as well. These got really substantial buffs, and whereas in 3.25 that wasn't necessarily understood by the whole player base, the significance of that, by 3.26 it definitely is. So most people are electing to use rare items rather than using So most players are electing to use rare items rather than electing to use those. Another thing about those rarity changes we talked about before, Crystallized Omniscience and Grace of the Goddess use isn't really up that much yet, mostly because players didn't notice just how much more common these items were. This wasn't disclosed in the patch notes, it's something that's just been one of those surprises, and like other undocumented changes, players don't really react to them very quickly. What this means, though, is that if you're playing in Trade League and you're planning an alt, definitely give some thought to both Crystallized Omniscience and Grace of the Goddess if they would work on your build. Okay, so let's take a look at the Ascendancy spread, the colors that you can't see on the... Okay, so let's take a look at the Ascendancy spread here, and Trickster and Warden are the two things that you can't see in terms of the actual key down in the bottom because my face is obscuring them. So we have Berserker in first place. It is the largest. So in first place we have the Berserker. Then we have the Chieftain, the Slayer, the Necromancer, the Elementalist, the Pathfinder, the Trickster, the Deadeye, the Hierophant, the Inquisitor, the Champion, the Occultist, the Juggernaut, the Warden, the Ascendant, the Gladiator, the Guardian, and then the Saboteur. Finally, in last place, this tiny little line here, this tiny little sliver, is the only Ascendancy that is doing terribly, and that is the Assassin. Even the Assassin is the best thing at a couple of things. There's a couple of Glass Cannon boss killer builds that it's really good at, but in general, every other Ascendancy is being played by... But in general, until a couple of days ago, every other Ascendancy was being played by at least 1.5% of the player base. Saboteur fell just under that in the last day before I recorded this, but then we have Assassin can't even make a 1/2 of 1%. So Assassin in a very bad place at the moment. So 18 out of the 19 Ascendancies have a pretty good place in the current meta. Berserker's hegemonic early. Now this started out at 27% of the ladder. Now this was 29% of the ladder if we look at day 3, 27% if we look at day 5, but now it's down to 19%. And the key thing I think that's coming up here is that Berserker and the Slams archetype, it's not that it's particularly overpowered, it's just that it's a really, really good early on, and it's really well understood how to gear it. So this creates a bit of an environment where people feel like Berserker is a safe starting point, and then after that, you can then either re-roll into whatever you really want to play, or potentially just something that's a little bit more experimental than what you started, or alternately, you can respec into something on the Chieftain Ascendancy, which is something we will discuss a little bit later on. So if we only look at level 100s though, things are a little bit different. It's a similar but slightly different story. There is one absolute legend who is playing an unascended shadow, who has taken an unascended shadow all the way to level 100. But the big effect here is the surge in the number of chieftains. And what I think we're seeing is that the Berserker is a very squishy ascendancy. The Chieftain is not so squishy, and its damage projection is phenomenal. So, a Chieftain ascendancy, especially one that's set up for Ignite. So a Chieftain build that is set up for Ignite, what these can do is they can set off a Hinekora explosion and pretty much propagate damage over an entire screen. This means they're very, very good at killing weaker monsters in phenomenally dense environments. What has phenomenally dense environments? Well, it's maps that are oriented towards leveling, because if there's one thing that's really noticeable when you're trying to level, you don't want to be dying very often, and the best way not to die very often is not to roll really, really brutal maps. This is why people that are trying to hit level 100, they do it in tier 16 maps rather than tier 17s, or in Zana influence / Gomage influence / whatever you want to call them, the new memory influence maps. Those ones will end up getting you minus 10%ed quite often, whereas regular tier 16 maps, once you get a bit of familiarity with using a regex to remove the ones that hamper your build, you can definitely get a lot of XP from them. So, Righteous Fire Chieftain, Cast When Stun Chieftain in general, both of these have extraordinary damage propagation, can just kill one monster, have it explode, and then delete the entire screen around, and they're inherently also very tanky as well. So if your goal is to hit level 100, then the Chieftain Ascendancy is best. And it's for this reason that in Solo Self-Bound, the first 3 people to hit level 100, all of them were playing the Chieftain Ascendancy. One of them will then later respec into a Berserker. So how about build diversity from a skill use perspective? I want to just start this section of the video out by talking about multiple skill builds. Some builds are hard to characterize. POE Ninja goes and has a look for builds that are using a skill that is 5-linked or 6-linked. And this does include things that are pseudo-links, so if you're using one of the Shaper or Elder Influence helmets that has additional supports in it, like Socketed Gems that's supported by level 18 minion life or things like that, those will count as a 5-link even though it's only 4 real gems. However, what this means is there's a number of skills where people are using a lot of 5+ links, and this comes up the most with minion setups. 50% of Animate Guardian builds are also Barma builds, Barma being Blink Arrow, Mirror Arrow, and that will make it onto the list of the top builds by skill use. Many of them are also Raised Spectre builds, and so on and so forth. What I'm doing here is I'm trying to characterize these. Sometimes it's a little bit unclear exactly how you'd characterize things, and so when it comes up that there's a bunch of different ways you could interpret the data, I'll mention that there's something a bit weird going on. Anyways, Blink Arrow, Mirror Arrow is the top minion build, so what I'm doing is everything that is a Barma build, I'm calling it a Barma build. If it's also a Raised Spectre build, I'm only calling it a Raised Spectre build if it is not a Barma build. That's why Fire Trap is not going to be on this list. Fire Trap is a top build. Fire Trap would be on this list of top builds by skill use, but there's only about 100 people that are playing Fire Trap without heavy focus on Righteous Fire, and only that 100 does not make it onto this list, does not come close. So let's start out with the top performer, Volcanic Fissure of Snaking. This is a Berserker build overwhelmingly. It doesn't have to be the Berserker. There are other ascendancies it can be played on, and it is all about using the Slams archetype. 18% of high-level players, 95 and up, are playing this build at the moment. This was huge early on, 29% day 3, 28% day 5, but it's fallen off since then. So, the reasons for this: excellent guides, it's strong enough to crush base level pinnacle bosses, it's strong enough to limp through tier 17 maps, and it can do that on less gear than most builds can. But, big important but, it is much harder to take it up another level from that. When you want to go from limping through 17s to utterly crushing them, Volcanic Fissure of Snaking can do it, but it doesn't do so easily. So, that's the reason that this is such a good build early on, and also why there's been such a precipitous fall off in it. It takes a cake over other slams due to its ability to seek out enemies. So you can play Volcanic Fissure of Snaking, you could also play Sunday, you could also play Earth Shatter, there's a bunch of other slams that are good, but Volcanic Fissure of Snack, this one you don't need to accurately target, and you can also preload a lot of damage. If you know a boss is going to spawn in 1.5 seconds, you can just start slamming away, and you'll have a bunch of slams that are already down when that boss actually does show. So if this skill were to get nerfed, there's a number of slightly worse slams that would just replace it. So, These are all fine. They're just a little bit... These are all fine skills. They're just slightly worse than the current best. It doesn't seem, though, to be... What I have noticed about this, though, is that a lot of people are playing it not because of the playstyle, but in spite of the playstyle. This is not a very popular build archetype. It's one that people are playing because it's good, rather than one that they're playing because they enjoy. In this way, I'd compare it to the Power Siphon Locust Mine builds that are extremely popular in last league. It's not that people thought that this was the most fun thing they've ever played. It's that they were playing it because it gets results early, and then you shift out of it into something you think will be more fun. And this is why it's fallen off to 18% now, and why I think more falls are coming in this skill's future. Second place, we have Righteous Fire. Now, a little bit of this is because it's such an easy build to respec into if you were previously playing Volcanic Fissure of Sneck, because they're on the same base class. So this build is played more than its power might lead you to expect. This is not the second strongest build of the league, but very different reasons to Volcanic Fissure of Snaking. It's a very simple and very satisfying playstyle. All you need to do, you charge into a pack of weak monsters, you explode. All you need to do, you charge into a pack of very weak monsters. One of them burns to death and explodes. That explosion then ignites all the ones that are around it, and you propagate that ignite through multiple different types of optional ignite transfer mechanics that exist in the game. There's ignite proliferation, there's on-death ignite transfers like is found on Beric's Respite and the Abrath boots, and there's a few other things that you can conceivably use as well. This then spreads the love over the entire screen. So it's not just one monster that's on fire, it's the whole screen worth. The other thing with this is that the explosions sound fantastic and they also look pretty good as well. Now this is one of the weakest skills when it comes to killing bosses in the game, especially when it comes to fighting the Maven, but it's also one that's quite a bit weaker on other bosses as well. It's not that you can't do it, it's just that it requires a lot more mechanical skill with those bosses. The big thing, though, about Trade League is that in the context of Trade League, being bad at bosses doesn't really matter. All it costs is maybe 100 chaos or so, and you can get a Voidstone carry through both the Maven and the... All it costs is maybe a Divine or so, and you can get a Voidstone carry through the Maven, through the original version of the Uber Elder encounter, and also through any of the tier 17 bosses in order to unlock the last of the Scarab slots. It's not that you can't do these fights yourself, it's just that they are much, much, much harder than they would be on other builds. And the other thing that's important to note is that other than tier 17 maps, which Righteous Fire tends not to be the best thing at, you don't generally repeat bosses much at... You don't generally repeat bosses very often in PathOfExile unless you specialize in them. Unless your entire league strategy is focused around, I'm going to build a character that's amazingly good at the Uber Maven fight, and I'm going to do the Uber Maven fight over and over again. So you have a big weakness, but it's a manageable one. You are the best build it. So you have a big weakness, but it's a manageable one. In exchange for tolerating this, you are the best build in the game, bar none, at clearing out a number of particular mechanics. You're the best build in the game at Breach, in my opinion. You're the best build in the game at Abyss, in my opinion. You are serviceable. You are the best build in the game, bar none, when it comes to Expedition. You are so much better at Expedition than any other build in the game that it's just not funny. And you're pretty good at a bunch of other mechanics, anything that involves densely packed monsters. At a popular playstyle, great guides for this, especially Pox's Righteous Fire Bible, and you end up with a guide, and you end up with a build that is very... And you end up with a build that is very, very justifiably as popular as it is. Now, this can be played on non-chieftain ascendancies too, especially in conjunction with the unique flask Oriath's End, which is something that an elementalist can put to great use in order to get similar sorts of explosions to what a chieftain does. But the chieftain is probably the best overall package. It just has a lot going for it. Next, we drop down to 4% of the player base running Smite of Divine Judgment. Now, it's worth noting, Smite of Divine Judgment does not play well with non-critical strike builds. Next, we have Smite of Divine Judgment sitting at 4% of high-level players. Now, this has mostly replaced the nerfed Frostblades of Catabasis and the nerfed Lightning Strike. Both of those builds are still playable, but Smite of Divine Judgment is probably better than both, and this is the preeminent critical strike-based Slayer build that uses a strike skill. That was a mouthful. That was a tongue twister. Other things are definitely playable in this spot. You can replace Smite of Divine Judgment with Frostblades, with Lightning Strike, with Frostblades of Catabasis, with a whole bunch of other things, but there's been a huge collapsing behind the one that seemed to be numerically slightly better than the other choices. It's a few percent ahead of the rest, and so it's considered not just the best, but the only one that anyone is really playing at all. The next build, slightly lower in the 4% range, is Barma, Blink Arrow and Mirror Arrow. So this uses the transfigured versions of Blink Arrow and Mirror Arrow, not as movement gems, although they do move you around, or at least Blink Arrow does. But what you're doing here is you are scaling up the damage that the clones that these leave behind do. So this ends up being a bow attack minion build of all of the weird combinations of things that you can get. Usually this is played on the Necromancer, but it is very, very viable on the Guardian and very, very viable on the Pathfinder. Each variant scales damage in very, very different ways. So these three builds are almost unrecognizable to each other. And I've got to say that when it comes to having a ranged attack skill, And I've got to say, it is somewhat refreshing that the top ranged attack skill list league is one that is not one of the usual offenders. Kinetic Blast has been fine in the past. In fact, it was once very, very, very popular. But now it has actually edged out all of the bow skills to be the top skill when it comes to making ranged attacks. This is a direct attack skill, unlike the Power Siphon Mine skills, unlike the Power Siphon Locust Mine builds that were popular last league. Usually it's played as Warden or Deadeye, and usually it's played on the Warden or the Deadeye ascendancies. Now typically, but not always, this uses Trinity support and Sacred Wisp support. Grace of the Goddess is very seriously worth considering if you're electing to play Kinetic Blast. You can also... It's much more accessible now than it's been in the past, but just be aware that rolling one that has 110% physical damage added as extra tri-elements, this is going to on average... But just be aware that rolling one to have 110% or higher collective physical damage added as the 3 elements, this is going to take on average 6 applications of Divine Orbs on Grace of the Goddess. Rolling it to be 120% or better, this is going to take an average of 24. And rolling it to be 120% or better, this is going to be an average of 24 Divine Orbs. So you're looking at something quite expensive. It would be better just to trade for one that's already been divined that high. In many cases, it'll be better to trade for one that's already been divined that high, and to just use one that is lower roll to start with. The final build that rolls more than 3.5%, so it rounds up to 4%, is Cast When Stunned Chieftain. Now, this is in many cases what people who league started as a Volcanic Fissure of Snaking build or as a Righteous Fire build, but wanted to change out of it, this is what they tend to settle on. So I expect that this number will go up. This captures a lot of the things that people like about the Righteous Fire Chieftain, the ability to propagate damage across entire screens, but it's in a more explosive and ultimately quite different package. This can become extremely tanky with massive, massive recovery of lost life, and it can scale damage extremely high as well. However, it can also struggle when against a solo boss. This is a very powerful build for doing content like the Simulacrum, and also a bunch of other things in the game. Very, very strong setup, and one that I expect will continue to rise in popularity as the league gets older. Poisonous Concoction of Bouncing is next, and this is one that peaked on day 5 at 4,758 players. However, it's fallen off since then. This is something people start as, with a view to then respecing to something else later. Usually played on the Pathfinder, scales damage via poison, and it's a top tier skill when it comes to early Atlas progression, but then once you do get deep into endgame, it tends to be something that people will change out of. Penance Brand of Dissipation is next at 3% as well. This is a top tier boss killer still. It was nerfed really hard after 3.23, but it was nerfed from S++ tier just down to A+ tier, and it's still an A+ tier boss killer. It's still really good, and one of the strongest things about it is that you do not need to stand still very much when you're using this skill. You can run up to a boss, you can run reasonably close to a boss once, cast the brand. You just need to spend a small percentage of your time actively recasting your brands, and as long as you do that, then the game... You just need to occasionally recast your brands, and as long as you do that, then those brands will just delete bosses for you. You can then focus all of your time on actively dodging whatever the boss is doing to you. And from a skill that doesn't require you to be up close and personal to one that does, Cyclone comes in next. Now, I thought long and hard about Cyclone. I was going to exclude it and just say, okay, this is really 3 or 4 different builds. And I don't think that I would fault anyone that thinks that's the way it should be put. There is Cyclone cast while channeling. There is Cyclone cast on critical strike. There is Cyclone shockwave, and there is Cyclone with none of those 3. And there are versions of Cyclone with none of those support gems. All of these play very differently to each other. All of them feel like different builds. I've decided to put them all into one category here, but I certainly won't fault you if you disagree. If you do disagree and split them up, none of them make this list at all. That said, Cyclone is something a good number of people are playing. And next we have one of my favorites because this one's new. Forbidden Rite of Soul Sacrifice. This was not on anyone's radar going into 3.26, but one of the new Pinnacle bosses drops a new unique item called Whispers of Infinity. This solves a huge problem with Forbidden Rite of Soul Sacrifice. When you look at this gem, you're going to think, hey, I really want to play this Chaos Inoculation. Then you look a bit closer at the gem and you see, oh, it has a cost that is paid in life rather than a cost that's paid in. Then you have another look at the gem and you go, oh, that doesn't work. This has a cost that's paid in life rather than a cost that's paid in either mana or energy shield, which are both resources you would have on a Chaos Inoculation build. Well, Whispers of Infinity completely addresses this because the cost is no longer required to be paid in life. Instead, it's paid in energy shield. If you use this amulet, Forbidden Rite of Soul Sacrifice and Chaos Inoculation becomes a tremendous setup. This is usually played on the Occultist, and it's usually played as instant application critical strike damage, but I think people will explore other ways to scale this in the future, and who knows what exactly they'll come up with over time. And from Smite of Divine Judgment to Baseline Smite. Baseline Smite has made it into the top skills of this league, coming in with 3% play rate. Historically, this has primarily been played as a skill on aura stackers and armor stackers, both of which tend to be champions, although they don't have to be. Those exist, but there are also people who are playing Smite without yet being transitioned into an aura stacker or without being transitioned into an armor stacker. So there's a lot of versatility here, and Smite is definitely outperforming my expectations when we went into 3.26. So here's a quick recap of the skills over 3%. We've got Volcanic Fissure of Sneck, 18%, Righteous Fire, also known as Fire Trap, 7%, Smite of Divine Judgment as a critical strike build, 5%, Barmer, 4%, Kinetic Blast, 4%, Cast When Stunned, 4%, Peacock Bouncing, 3%, Penance Branded Dissipation, 3%, Cyclone, 3%, Forbidden Rite of Soul Sacrifice, 3%, and Smite, 3%. So what have we seen in the way of breakout uniques? So there's a couple of things that certain builds can use, like that Whispers of Infinity amulet. But really, there's not many uniques being used full stop in 3.26. There's of course some of the perennial offenders, things like Mageblood, things like Headhunter, things that everyone knows are good. Relikesh's Impatience got nerfed really hard in 3.26, and yet it is still considered and yet it is still seeing a lot of use. But the big breakout unique is not something you put on your character, it's something you put on your merc, and that is Doriani's Prototype. For most builds, the single biggest upgrade you can make is to change your skill so that it's something that can deal physical damage. For most builds, the single biggest upgrade you can make is to change your skill to something that can deal either physical or lightning damage. If it is physical, convert that to lightning, and then take advantage of a merc that is using Doriani's Prototype. Doing this will probably do more damage on a 3-link than you would otherwise do on a 6-link. And ultimately, that's where we're going to leave our first look at the meta for 3.26. May Eval Orbs have interesting results.